Tonight we wade into the gritty, the uncertain, and the not-so-glorious side of a story that unfolds not on battlefields but in the quiet, feverish stillness of a sick room. You might picture swaying palms and turquoise waters, but behind that postcard image lies a persistent, invisible hunter. The truth is, to live with its constant threat, to know that any quiet buzz in the air could mean weeks of agony, was a profound and wearing exhaustion. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Silence your notifications, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Our story does not begin with a microscope or a laboratory or a neatly labelled sample of blood. It begins, as so many tales of sickness do, with a cryptic whisper from the past, a faint and fading ink stain on a silk scroll. We must travel back, far back, to the fragmented and turbulent world of 4th century China, to the Jin dynasty. This was not a time of monolithic power, but of fracture and strife, a land of rival courts and nomadic invasions, where certainty was a luxury, and life was often precarious. In this world of shifting allegiances and profound philosophies, a remarkable scholar named Ge took it upon himself to compile a practical manual for the common person, a book of remedies for when a doctor was miles away, or when disaster struck without warning. He called it the Zhouhou Beiji Fang, a handbook of prescriptions for emergencies. And buried within its collection of treatments for everything from snake bites to demonic possession is a passage that sends a quiet chill down the spine of modern epidemiologists. Jie Hong speaks of a condition he calls shui du, the water poison. The name itself is a clue, a ghostly fingerprint left at the scene of a crime some 17 centuries ago. He did not, of course, understand the mechanism. He could not see the microscopic world teeming in a single droplet. But his powers of observation were acute. He linked this particular affliction to water, but also, crucially, to what he described as flying insects. These creatures, he noted, carried the poison from the water to an unsuspecting human. The description of the illness that followed the bite is what truly arrests our attention. It was not a slow creeping malady, it was an assault. A sudden high fever would seize the patient, followed by a constellation of miseries. A brilliant red rash would erupt across the skin, a rash he likened to fine crimson sand sprinkled over the body. And then came the pain, a deep, relentless ache in the bones and joints, a pain so profound it felt as though the very marrow was on fire. The head would throb, the eyes would burn, and a profound weakness would leave the sufferer utterly prostrate. Ge Hong noted that if the patient did not bleed from the nose or mouth, they would likely recover, but the convalescence would be long and draining. We must be careful, of course. To apply a modern diagnosis to an ancient text is an act of interpretation, not certainty. The language is poetic, filtered through a medical framework that understood the body as a landscape of energies and elements, not cells and viruses. Other illnesses could, perhaps, fit this description. And yet the details are so uncannily specific. The sudden onset, the high fever, the rash, the excruciating joint pain, and most of all that vital connection, the water, and the flying insects that emerge from it. It is almost as if Ge Hong was standing on the shore of a vast, dark ocean of knowledge, pointing a finger into the gloom at the two culprits we know so well today, stagnant water and the mosquito that breeds within it. He was seeing the shadow of Aedes aegypti, the shadow of the flavivirus it carries, without having the language or the tools to name the true form of the monster. For over 1,000 years after Ge Hong put his brush to silk, this water poison seems to fade from the official record. Perhaps it simply simmered in isolated communities, a local misery not worthy of grand historical notice. Perhaps the records that might have told its story were lost to fire, or flood, or the simple indifference of time. The trail goes cold, the ghost vanishes into the mist of the centuries, and then it returns, not as a whisper, but as a roar. It does not reappear in one place, but in many, erupting almost simultaneously in a terrifying display of global reach. The world had changed. The quiet, contemplative pace of Gehong's China had given way to a new and restless age, an age of sail. By the 17th and 18th centuries, humanity had woven a web of sea lanes across the planet. Great wooden ships, marvels of engineering and ambition, were crisscrossing the oceans, driven by wind and the inexhaustible human appetite for wealth, for empire, for spices, for sugar, for gold, and for other human beings. These ships were the engines of a new globalized world, connecting continents in ways that would have been unimaginable just a few hundred years prior. They carried soldiers and merchants, missionaries and colonists, and tragically, millions of enslaved Africans. But they carried other passengers as well, tiny stowaways hidden from sight. They carried the dengue virus, and its indispensable partner, the mosquito Aedes aegypti. The sailing ship of the 18th century was, from a mosquito's perspective, a paradise. It was a self-contained mobile incubator. The journeys were long, lasting for months on end. And on every single one of these vessels, the most precious commodity, more valuable than rum or textiles, was fresh water. It was stored in large wooden casks or scuttled butts, often left open on the deck to catch the rain and to allow for easy access. These open containers of stagnant fresh water were the perfect nurseries for Aedes aegypti larvae. The female mosquito, having taken a blood meal from an infected person in a port city in West Africa or Southeast Asia, would lay her eggs just above the waterline inside these barrels. The eggs themselves are remarkably resilient. They can survive for months in a dry state, a period of dormancy, waiting for the next rain shower at sea or for the barrel to be topped up in the next port of call. Then they would hatch. A new generation of mosquitoes would emerge, mid-ocean, ready to bite the densely packed captive human population of the ship. The virus would circulate silently from mosquito to human and back to mosquito, amplifying itself on the slow voyage across the Atlantic or around the Cape of Good Hope. The ship became a vector in itself, a Trojan horse delivering a plague to unsuspecting shores. And so, in the fateful years of 1779 and 1780, the ghost of the water poison returned with a vengeance, manifesting in a synchronized global pandemic. The first clear, undeniable accounts emerge from Batavia, the sweltering canal-choked capital of the Dutch East Indies, known today as Jakarta. It was a jewel in the Dutch colonial crown, a bustling hub of the spice trade where ships from Europe, India and China converged. In 1779, a Dutch physician named David Bylan chronicled a sudden, explosive epidemic of what the locals called knuckle fever. He described its bewildering speed, how it would lay waste to entire neighbourhoods in a matter of days. He noted the agonising joint pain, the rash, the fever, the same grim trinity that Gehong had observed. At almost the exact same time, the disease erupted thousands of miles away. In the ancient city of Cairo, a vital crossroads of trade between Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East. It swept through the city's crowded quarters, leaving a trail of misery, and from there it crossed the Mediterranean and the vast Atlantic. By 1780, it had arrived on the shores of the newly independent United States of America. It exploded in Philadelphia. Philadelphia in 1780 was the largest city in North America, the humming political and cultural heart of a fledgling nation still fighting for its existence. It was a city of brick and cobblestone, a revolutionary fervour, and intellectual ambition. And it was a major port. Ships from the Caribbean laden with sugar, molasses and rum docked constantly at its wharves along the Delaware River. They brought with them the goods that fueled the colonial economy, and they brought with them the scuttled butts of water, teeming with the descendants of mosquitoes from another continent. In the hot, humid summer of that year, the city's inhabitants began to fall ill with a terrifying and unfamiliar sickness. The disease did not discriminate. It struck the rich in their Georgian townhouses and the poor in their cramped alleyways. It struck dock workers, merchants, and the families of the founding fathers. The city's physicians were baffled. They were men of the Enlightenment, believers in reason and observation, yet they were helpless. They fell back on the medical theories of their day, blaming the sickness on unwholesome vapours, on pestilential miasmas rising from the marshlands, on the alignment of the stars, on anything but the tiny, striped-legged insect that was quietly breeding in their own backyard rain barrels and feasting on them in the twilight hours. One physician, however, would rise to the challenge of describing this new torment, and in doing so he would give the disease its most visceral and enduring name. His name was Dr. Benjamin Rush. A towering figure in early American history, Rush was more than just a physician. He was a patriot, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, a social reformer, a professor of medicine, and the Surgeon General of the Continental Army. He was a man of boundless energy and unshakable conviction, a product of his time in both his genius and his flaws. His medical philosophy was rooted in what was called heroic medicine, a brutal system of bleeding, blistering and purging, predicated on the belief that the body's humours had to be rebalanced through aggressive intervention. While his treatments for the fever were likely more harmful than helpful, his skills as a clinical observer were second to none. He kept meticulous notes on the 1780 Philadelphia epidemic, documenting its every grim feature with a clarity that cuts through the centuries. He watched as his patients were struck down as if by a sudden blow. One moment they were healthy, the next they were consumed by a raging fever and a headache he described as a painful tension or drawing over the whole forehead. But it was the pain in the limbs that most captivated and horrified him. This was not the familiar ache of influenza. This was something different, something monstrous in its intensity. He wrote of patients who complained of a soreness in their bones so extreme that they felt as if their very skeleton was being twisted and pulled apart on a rack. They cried out in agony with the slightest movement. The simple pressure of a bedsheet was unbearable. They could not find a position of comfort. Rush, searching for a phrase to capture the essence of this unique torment, to communicate its brutal mechanical violence, coined a term of pure descriptive genius. He called it breakbone fever. The name was perfect. It was not scientific, it was not Latin, but it was profoundly human. It conveyed the subjective experience of the sufferer with a power that no clinical term ever could. Anyone who heard the name breakbone fever instantly understood the nature of the enemy. It was a name born of empathy and horror, a label for an unspeakable level of pain. Rush's account, published in 1789, became the definitive clinical description of the disease for nearly a century. Breakbone fever entered the medical lexicon and the public imagination. Yet at the same time another name was beginning to circulate, a curious and exotic word whose origins are wrapped in the mists of colonialism and linguistic drift. The word was dengue. Where did it come from? The historical record is a puzzle. The most widely accepted theory traces it back to the Swahili coast of East Africa, a region deeply enmeshed in the Indian Ocean trade networks and the Arab slave trade. The proposed route is a Swahili phrase, kadinga pepo, or ki denga pipo. The meaning is debated, but it roughly translates to a sudden, cramp-like seizure caused by an evil spirit. The word dinga, or denga, implies a contortion, a sudden cramping or stiffening. The Swahili-speaking peoples of the coast would have seen sufferers of the fever walking with an unnatural stiffness, their movements cautious and pained, as if they were being manipulated by a malevolent force. It was a supernatural explanation for a biological phenomenon. The theory suggests that this phrase was picked up in the slave markets of Zanzibar or the port cities of the Caribbean, where enslaved Africans were tragically transported. It would have been overheard by Spanish slave traders and colonists. In the linguistic blender of the New World, the Swahili phrase was likely shortened and corrupted, its grammar smoothed to fit the Spanish tongue. Ki denga became simply dengue. There is a competing, though less favoured theory that connects it directly to the Spanish language itself. The Spanish word dengue means prudishness, coyness, or affectation. The The idea is that a Spanish speaker observing the mincing, careful gait of someone afflicted with breakbone fever, a walk designed to minimise the excruciating pain in their joints, might have sarcastically compared it to the delicate, affected mannerisms of a dandy or a prude. In this version, the name is a piece of cruel gallows humour. Whichever story is true, and we may never know for certain, the name stuck. It first appeared in print in a Spanish chronicle of a Cuban epidemic in 1828. From there, dengue began its slow march to global acceptance, eventually supplanting the more descriptive but less clinical breakbone fever in official medical literature. And so, by the dawn of the 19th century, the ancient water poison had a modern identity. It had two names, in fact, one that described the pain and one that hinted at its mysterious foreign origins. The disease had circumnavigated the globe, proving itself a masterful opportunist, a silent passenger on the great project of human expansion. Its symptoms were now well documented. Its patterns of eruption, sudden, explosive and overwhelming, were becoming grimly familiar to physicians in port cities from Boston to Brazil, from Cadiz to Calcutta. A clinical picture had been painstakingly assembled. A name had been assigned. But the fundamental mystery remained untouched. The perpetrator was still at large. The link that Gay Hong had so astutely observed between flying insects and the water poison had been forgotten, dismissed as folk belief in an age that prided itself on scientific reason. Doctors like Benjamin Rush looked for the cause in the air, in the soil, in the moral character of their patients, anywhere but in the humble water barrel sitting just outside the door. The true culprit, the tiny black and white striped mosquito, continued its work in plain sight, utterly invisible. The stage was set for the next chapter of our story, the slow, painstaking hunt for a killer that no one even knew they were looking for. The turn of the 20th century was a time of supreme, almost arrogant confidence in the medical sciences. The old ghosts were being exorcised one by one, the vague, shapeless dread of miasma, the belief in foul airs and pestilential vapours rising from swamps and filth, was finally being laid to rest in a pauper's grave. In its place stood the firm microscopic certainty of the germ. A new pantheon of titans, Pasteur, Koch, Lister, had revealed a hidden world of bacteria and microbes, tiny assassins that could be isolated, stained, studied, and most importantly, defeated. It was an age of light, of peering through brass microscopes and seeing, for the first time, the true faces of humanity's oldest enemies. Cholera, tuberculosis, anthrax. Their secrets were being unlocked. But some mysteries remained, wrapped in the shimmering heat of the tropics. Diseases like malaria, yellow fever, and our old painful acquaintance dengue refused to yield their secrets so easily. They were caused by agents too small to be seen with the microscopes of the day, what would eventually be called viruses, and they had an accomplice, a silent partner, that allowed them to move through the world with devastating speed. The first hint of this accomplice came not from a pristine European laboratory, but from the humid port city of Amoy in China. A Scottish doctor named Patrick Manson, a man of incredible patience and meticulous observation, was studying a grotesque disease called elephantiasis. He watched, night after night, as his patients slept, drawing their blood and examining it. He noticed something extraordinary. The tiny parasitic worms that caused the disease, the filariae, only appeared in the blood at night. During the day, they vanished. Manson theorized, he wondered, where did they go? And how did they travel from one person to another? His gaze fell upon the creature that also came out only at night, the one that fed on sleeping patients, the mosquito. In 1877, he painstakingly dissected mosquitoes that had fed on his patients and found them writhing with the larval worms. He had discovered the principle of the vector. He had proven that an insect could be a crucial link in the chain of infection, a living, flying hypodermic needle. It was a revolutionary idea, and like most revolutionary ideas, it was met with a great deal of skepticism, but the seed was planted. A younger physician, Ronald Ross, working for the Indian Medical Service, was mesmerised by Manson's theory. He became obsessed, dedicating his life to a singular maddening quest to prove that the mosquito carried malaria. For years he toiled in the blistering heat of India, dissecting thousands upon thousands of mosquitoes, his eyes strained, his patience worn to a thread. He called them dappled-winged and grey mosquitoes, meticulously categorising the insects that bit his malaria patients. Then on August 20th, 1897, a day he would forever call Mosquito Day, he finally found it. In the stomach wall of an Anopheles mosquito, he saw the malaria parasite growing and developing. The circle was closed. The proof was absolute. The mosquito was the vector. For this, Ross would win the Nobel Prize, and the world of medicine would be forever changed. With malaria solved, the focus shifted to another great tropical killer, yellow fever. In Spanish-occupied Cuba, a local doctor named Carlos Finlay had been insisting since 1881 that a specific mosquito, a small dark insect with elegant white markings on its legs and a lyre-shaped pattern on its back, was the culprit. He called it Culex fasciatus. We know it today as Aedes aegypti. For almost 20 years, nobody listened. He was dismissed as an eccentric. But after the Spanish-American War, when American soldiers began dying in droves from the Yellow Jack, the US, Army sent a commission led by a stoic major named Walter Reed to solve the puzzle. What followed was an act of quiet scientific bravery that borders on the insane. At Camp Laziar, named for a commission member who died of a self-inflicted, experimental yellow fever infection, Reed's team built 2 small screened houses. In one, volunteers slept on the soiled, vomit-stained sheets and pyjamas of men who had died from yellow fever, breathing the supposedly foul air. They remained perfectly healthy. In the other house, which was kept immaculately clean, volunteers were simply exposed to mosquitoes, Finley's mosquitoes, that had previously fed on yellow fever patients. They fell sick one after another. The experiments were irrefutable. Finley was right. Aedes aegypti was the vector. The news electrified the world. For the first time, a viral disease was shown to be insect-borne. And here the story turns back to dengue. For observant physicians, the pattern was unmistakable. Dengue epidemics often preceded or followed yellow fever outbreaks. They occurred in the same hot, humid places. They were both diseases of port cities and coastal towns. And lurking at every crime scene was the same smartly dressed little suspect, Aedes aegypti. The mosquito that ferried the yellowjack was almost certainly moonlighting, carrying the breakbone fever as well. All that was needed was proof. The proof came not from a well-funded government commission, but from the patient work of a single physician in Brisbane, Australia, Dr. Thomas Bancroft, whose father had been a renowned naturalist, possessed a deep curiosity about the natural world. Between 1905 and 1906, during a dengue outbreak, he conducted a series of elegant, simple, and incredibly dangerous experiments. He captured Aedes aegypti mosquitoes and allowed them to feed on his dengue patients during the early feverish stage of their illness. He then kept the mosquitoes alive, feeding them on fruit and water, waiting. After a few days, he transported the mosquitoes to his home, where 2 volunteers who had never had dengue were waiting. The volunteers, with a quiet courage that history has largely forgotten, thrust their arms into the cages. They were bitten. And a few days later, both developed the classic agonising symptoms of dengue fever. Bancroft had his proof. Just to be certain, he had the experiment confirmed half a world away. In 1907, in the Philippines, 2 US Army doctors, Percy Ashburn and Charles Craig, were investigating the strange fevers that so often incapacitated soldiers stationed there. They had heard of Bancroft's work. Working in Manila, they repeated the experiment with even greater rigour. They built screened rooms. They recruited volunteers from the Bilibid prison. They systematically demonstrated not only that Aedes aegypti could transmit the disease, but that the blood of a dengue patient was infectious only during the first few days of fever. They even filtered the blood through porcelain filters designed to trap bacteria, and showed that the filtered cell-free fluid could still cause the disease, proving the causative agent was something much, much smaller. It was a virus. By 1908, the case was closed. The agent was a filterable virus. The vector was the Aedes aegypti mosquito, a creature of exquisite, maddening adaptation. It did not breed in swamps or ponds like the malaria mosquito. It bred in small, clean collections of water. It was a domestic creature, a creature of the city. It laid its eggs in the water pitcher in the kitchen, the flower vase on the table, the rainwater collecting in a discarded can in the backyard. It had evolved alongside humanity, making our homes its home. It preferred human blood above all others. And it was a daytime feeder, a dainty biter, often attacking ankles and elbows, taking a small blood meal and then moving on to another person in the same room, making it a terrifyingly efficient spreader of disease within a household. The mystery of transmission was solved. The enemy had been identified. It was a tiny, elegant and deeply intimate foe. And humanity, armed with this new knowledge, was about to create the perfect conditions for it to conquer the world. The first half of the 20th century was a period defined by conflict on an industrial scale. Humanity perfected new ways of killing itself, moving vast armies and machinery across oceans with an efficiency never before seen. And with every troop ship, every supply convoy, every plane, something else travelled. Unseen, unlisted on any manifest. The dengue virus and its loyal vector, Aedes aegypti. War, it turns out, is the best friend a mosquito-borne virus could ever ask for. It is a massive, chaotic and unintentional cultivation program. World War I offered a glimpse of this, with the water-filled shell craters and trenches of Europe providing breeding grounds for mosquitoes. But the true expansion, the great viral diaspora, came with the Second World War, particularly in the sprawling, sweltering theatre of the Pacific. Imagine the situation. Millions of young men, mostly from North America, Europe and Australia, who had never been exposed to dengue, were suddenly deposited into the very heart of its endemic zones. The Philippines, New Guinea, Burma, the countless islands that dotted the Pacific like stepping stones. They were immunologically naive, a vast untapped resource for the virus. The Japanese Empire, expanding southward, moved its own non-immune soldiers from the home islands into the same regions. It was the perfect storm. The logistics of the war itself created a paradise for Aedes. The mosquito doesn't need a swamp, it needs a teacup, and war provides endless teacups. Every foxhole dug in the jungle floor filled with rain, every discarded ration can, every shell casing, every steel helmet left upturned became a potential nursery. The tens of thousands of rubber tyres on jeeps, trucks and aircraft, when stored outside, collected water in their rims. Water barrels on naval ships, essential for freshwater supplies, were often poorly covered. The bilge water in transport vessels sloshed with larvae. The Allies and the Axis, in their struggle for supremacy, were unintentionally farming mosquitoes on an unprecedented scale. They were meticulously, if accidentally, landscaping the entire Pacific basin into the world's largest Aedes aegypti breeding ground. The epidemics that followed were explosive and debilitating. Dengue became a major strategic factor, a third army in the conflict that fought for neither side. In New Guinea, during the brutal jungle campaigns of 1942 and 1943, both Allied and Japanese forces were crippled by outbreaks. It acquired nicknames born of misery: Kokoda flu, Finschhafen fever. At its peak, entire platoons would be incapacitated simultaneously, unable to fight, barely able to stand, their joints screaming with pain. General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters in the southwest Pacific area reported that for a time dengue was causing more casualties, more men removed from active duty than enemy action. A report from the Aitape-Wewak campaign noted that in one Australian division of around 15,000 men, There were over 27,000 cases of fever-related illness, the vast majority of which were dengue. The numbers are staggering. The disease didn't kill many, not yet, but it was a logistical nightmare. It broke the momentum of attacks. It strained medical resources to the breaking point. It was a constant demoralizing grind. The same story played out across the theatre. In the Philippines, American forces retaking the islands faced wave after wave of the fever. On Pacific islands that had never before reported the disease, outbreaks suddenly flared up after a naval fleet or a supply convoy arrived. The virus was island hopping right alongside the Marines. In 1942, a massive epidemic swept through Brisbane, Australia, infecting an estimated 15,000 people. It was fueled by the return of soldiers from the New Guinea front, bringing the virus back with them to a city teeming with Aedes aegypti. The war wasn't just spreading the virus to new places, it was bringing it home. But the most significant development of the war was happening at a microscopic level, silently in the bloodstreams of millions of soldiers, sailors and civilians. Before the war, the different types or serotypes of the dengue virus were largely confined to their own geographical regions. Perhaps DENV1 was common in Southeast Asia, while DENV2 was circulating in the Pacific Islands. They existed in relative isolation. The war changed everything. It acted like a giant chaotic blender. A soldier might contract DNV1 in the Philippines, recover, and then be shipped to a staging area in New Guinea, where he is bitten by a mosquito carrying DNV2. A sailor on a warship might be infected with one strain in Calcutta, and then transport that virus in his own blood to a port in Fiji, introducing it to a new population and potentially a new resident strain. For the first time in history, the 4 distinct serotypes of the dengue virus were being commingled on a massive intercontinental scale. This was the war's most profound and terrifying legacy. It was an unseen biological consequence, a quiet seeding of the future. The soldiers who survived dengue during the war carried with them an immunity, but it was a fragile, specific immunity, a key for only one lock. Their bodies had learned to recognize one type of dengue, but they were now living in a world where other unfamiliar types were suddenly present. The war had mixed the deck. Mixed. It had shuffled the viral cards. And in the decades to follow, in the peaceful burgeoning cities of a post-war Asia, humanity was about to be dealt a terrible new hand. The great expansion was complete. The stage was now set for a shocking transformation. The 1950s dawned with a fragile sense of optimism. The Great War was over. The world was rebuilding. In places like the Philippines and Thailand, a new era of independence and growth was beginning. Cities like Manila and Bangkok were magnets for hope, drawing people from the countryside with the promise of work and a better life. They swelled, growing rapidly, often chaotically. Neighbourhoods sprang up, dense with humanity, but often lacking in consistent sanitation, running water and waste disposal. In the rush to build the future, the perfect urban habitat for an old enemy was being constructed. The water storage drums, the earthenware jars, the discarded containers, the clogged gutters, they were everywhere, and so was Aedes aegypti. In 1953, in a Manila still bearing the scars of war, physicians in the city's hospitals began to see something they had never seen before. It started with children. They would be brought in with a high fever, a headache, the familiar aches and pains of dengue. It looked like a typical, if severe, case of the breakbone fever. The doctors were not overly alarmed. They would prescribe rest, fluids, and something to manage the fever. But then, a few days into the illness, a frightening change would occur. The child's fever might even begin to drop, a seemingly hopeful sign. But it was a ruse. Tiny pinprick-sized red spots, called petechiae, would start to appear on the skin. The child's gums would begin to bleed. A sudden nosebleed, difficult to stop, larger, darker bruises would blossom on their limbs with no apparent injury. This was terrifyingly new. Dengue did not do this. And then came the final catastrophic stage. The child would become restless, agitated, their skin growing cold and clammy despite the tropical heat. Their pulse would become rapid and weak. This was the onset of shock. The circulatory system was beginning to fail. Inside the child's body, a hidden crisis was unfolding. Their blood vessels were becoming permeable, leaky. The plasma, the liquid portion of their blood, was seeping out into their body cavities, starving the vital organs of blood and oxygen. The blood pressure would plummet. Without rapid, intensive medical intervention, the slide towards death was swift and irreversible. The Filipino doctors were baffled and horrified. They were witnessing a familiar disease transform into a monstrous killer, and it was targeting the most vulnerable. They gave it a name based on what they saw: Philippine hemorrhagic fever. The first major documented outbreak in 1954 was a profound shock to the medical community. Between 1953 and 1956, over 1,000 cases were reported, with a frighteningly high mortality rate. The world took notice, but the phenomenon was still seen as a local anomaly, a strange, virulent form of fever confined to the Philippines. That perception was shattered in 1958. In Bangkok, the bustling, vibrant capital of Thailand, an even larger and more terrifying epidemic erupted. Again, the victims were overwhelmingly children. The clinical picture was identical to what had been seen in Manila: the fever, the bleeding, the terrifying slide into shock. The paediatric wards of Bangkok's hospitals were overwhelmed. Thai physicians, led by the astute Dr. Suchitra Nimanitya, began to meticulously document the new disease. They observed the plasma leakage, the low platelet counts, the high concentration of red blood cells as the plasma fled the bloodstream. They systematically defined the illness, giving it the names that would stick, the names that still instill a clinical dread today: dengue hemorrhagic fever, or DHF, and its most severe life-threatening manifestation, dengue shock syndrome, or DSS. The question was no longer what it was, but why it was happening. Why now? Why, after centuries of causing painful but survivable illness, had dengue suddenly learned how to kill? The answer was a devilishly clever piece of biological treachery, a cruel twist orchestrated by the body's own defences, and the clues led back to the great viral mixing of the Second World War. The man who helped piece it all together was, ironically, famous for saving children from another virus: Albert Sabin, the creator of the oral polio vaccine. He and other researchers hypothesized that the key was not a single infection, but a second one. They proposed a theory that would come to be known as antibody-dependent enhancement, or ADE. The mechanism is a masterpiece of pathogenic irony. When a person is infected with a dengue virus, say DENV1, their immune system produces antibodies. These antibodies are highly effective, and they provide lifelong immunity, but only to DENV1. If, years later, that same person is infected with a different serotype, say DENV2, a disaster can unfold. The old antibodies from the first infection recognize the new virus. They rush to attack it. But because the new virus is slightly different, they cannot neutralize it effectively. They are a key for the wrong lock. Instead of destroying the virus, bind to it, forming a complex. And here is the betrayal. Certain immune cells in the body have receptors that are designed to grab onto the tail of an antibody. The antibody, now attached to the DENV2 virus, essentially provides a VIP pass, a Trojan horse that allows the virus to more easily enter these immune cells, the very cells meant to destroy it. Once inside, the virus replicates with incredible speed, producing a far higher viral load than would occur in a primary infection. This triggers a massive panicked overreaction from the immune system, a cytokine storm that causes the blood vessels to become leaky, leading to the bleeding, the plasma loss, and the circulatory collapse of DHF and DSS. The immune system, in its attempt to protect, becomes the agent of destruction. An individual's own immunological history, their own survival of a past infection, had become their greatest liability. This was the war's delayed action bomb. The global conflict had scattered the 4 dengue serotypes across Asia and the Pacific, like a farmer sowing seeds. In the post-war years, these seeds began to sprout. The baby boom created a huge population of immunologically blank slates. In the newly crowded cities of Manila and Bangkok, where multiple serotypes now circulated simultaneously, the perfect conditions for sequential infection were met. A child might get a mild case of DNV1 at age 3, barely noticed by their parents. Then at age 7, they encounter DNV2. Their own antibodies, a memory of their first victory against the virus, would turn against them, transforming a second, otherwise manageable infection into a life-threatening crisis. The Manila shock was the dreadful dawn of this new reality. The puzzle was solved, but the picture it revealed was horrifying. Dengue fever, the old breakbone fever, the inconvenient nuisance of colonial armies and tropical travellers, had evolved. Or rather, humanity had rearranged the world in such a way as to unlock its deadliest potential. It was no longer just a plague of pain. It was now a killer of children. To understand the true cruel genius of the dengue virus, you must first understand a betrayal. Betrayal that happens deep within the warm, dark territory of your own body. It is a biological paradox, a piece of evolutionary theatre so perverse it took scientists decades to truly comprehend. Imagine your immune system as a vast and ancient library of memory. When a virus, say dengue serotype 1, enters your bloodstream for the first time, your body's defenders are initially confused. They scramble, they fight, and eventually they learn. They craft a perfect weapon, a highly specific antibody, a key designed for one and only one lock. This antibody latches onto the virus, neutralizes it, tags it for destruction. A memory of this key is then stored away forever. Should dengue serotype 1 ever try to invade again, the library is ready. The perfect keys are produced in overwhelming numbers. The invader is annihilated, and you are granted lifelong sterilizing immunity. It is a beautiful, elegant system. It is what is supposed to happen. But dengue is not one virus. It is a family of 4 closely related but distinct siblings, 4 serotypes. And here, in this subtle familial difference, lies the trap. Let us say that years later you are travelling and a different mosquito in a different city injects you with a new foe, dengue serotype 2. Your immune system, remembering the long-ago battle, rushes to the library. It pulls out the old keys, the antibodies for serotype 1. They look almost right. The new virus is a cousin of the old one, and the antibodies recognise the family resemblance. They swarm the new virus, attempting to bind to it. But the keys do not quite fit the lock. They are loose, they jiggle, they can hold on, but they cannot neutralise. They cannot disable the virus. And this is where the betrayal begins. This clumsy, imperfect binding does something far worse than nothing at all. It turns your own defence into the enemy's most effective tool. The antibody, still clinging weakly to the virus, now acts as a Trojan horse. Your body's frontline garbage collectors, the cells called macrophages and monocytes, are designed to consume anything tagged by an antibody. They see this antibody-virus complex and, following their programming, dutifully open their doors to receive it, to devour and destroy it. But because the antibody's grip is flawed, the virus is not neutralized. It is instead given a VIP escort directly inside the very cell that was meant to be its executioner. It has bypassed all the outer defences. It has been hand-delivered to its primary replication factory. Once inside that cell, the virus hijacks the cellular machinery and begins to replicate with a terrifying explosive efficiency. The viral load in the bloodstream skyrockets to levels 10, 100, even 1,000 times higher than what would have occurred during a first infection. Your body panics. Faced with this overwhelming viral tide, the immune system unleashes a desperate scorched earth response. It floods the system with alarm signals, inflammatory proteins called cytokines. It is a cytokine storm, a full-scale internal riot. This chemical blizzard is what attacks you, not the virus itself. It makes your blood vessels, the delicate plumbing of your entire body, porous and leaky. Plasma, the vital fluid component of your blood begins to seep out into your tissues. Your blood thickens to sludge, your blood pressure plummets. This is dengue hemorrhagic fever. This is dengue shock syndrome. The very memory that should have saved you has become the architect of your potential demise. This phenomenon, this elegant treachery, is called antibody-dependent enhancement, or ADE. It was a puzzle that haunted researchers for years, particularly a man named Scott Halstead, who, working in the stifling heat of 1960s Bangkok, watched with dismay as seemingly healthy children who had weathered a mild dengue infection one year would succumb to a catastrophic bleeding illness. Next, he painstakingly pieced together the evidence, proposing this almost unbelievable theory that the ghost of an old infection could conspire with a new one to kill you. He was right, and this intimate, microscopic betrayal would set the stage for a macroscopic, continental failure. Having glimpsed the sheer biological cunning of the virus, its ability to turn the body's strength against itself, you can almost forgive the public health officials of the mid-20th century for their chosen strategy. They looked at the impossible complexity of the four serotypes, the puzzle of ADE, and decided to sidestep the problem entirely. Their logic was brutally simple. If you cannot easily fight the phantom, you must destroy its carriage, you must eliminate its taxi service. You must declare a total and unconditional war on the mosquito itself. This was not to be a campaign of swatting and spraying bug repellent. This was to be a war of annihilation, a continental crusade to erase an entire species from the Western Hemisphere. It was one of the most ambitious and hubristic public health campaigns ever conceived. His chief architect and field marshal was a man named Fred Soper. Soper, first with the Rockefeller Foundation and later with the Pan American Health Organization, or PAHO, was a figure of legendary, almost frightening single-mindedness. He saw disease not as a condition, but as an enemy army to be defeated with military discipline, relentless logistics, and overwhelming force. And his enemy was Aedes aegypti. He understood this creature intimately. This was not some wild mosquito of the distant jungle. Aedes aegypti was a domestic companion, a creature of the city. It had evolved alongside us for centuries, abandoning forest streams for the tiny man-made pools of water we collect around ourselves. A flowerpot saucer, a discarded tire, a clogged rain gutter, the dregs of water in a discarded can. These were its preferred nurseries. It was, as Soper knew, a creature of our own making, a shadow that lived in our closets and under our beds, breeding in the evidence of our own casual neglect. Soper's weapon of choice was a new miracle of chemistry, dichlorodiphenyltrichloroethane, DDT. It was cheap, it was persistent, and it was lethally effective. And his army was a corps of thousands of public health workers, the guardas, dressed in uniforms, imbued with a military ethos, and sent to march block by block, house by house, through every city, town and village in the Americas. Their strategy was called the perifocal method. It was a meticulous ritual. When a breeding site was found, say a water drum, the guarda would not only treat the water to kill the larvae, they would then spray a residual layer of DDT on all surrounding surfaces, the walls, the underside of furniture, any place where a newly hatched adult mosquito might rest its legs for even a moment. It was a chemical minefield laid in every home. The result for a time was nothing short of miraculous. From the late 40s through the 1950s and into the early 1960s, Soper's war machine rolled across the continent, and the mosquito vanished before it. You could watch the victory on a map. Brazil, a country whose landmass was once a fortress of yellow fever and dengue, was declared free of Aedes aegypti in 1958. Bolivia, Paraguay, Ecuador, Peru, much of Central America, country after country saw the last of the urban mosquito. By Mars 62, 18 continental nations and a host of Caribbean islands had been scrubbed clean. An entire ecosystem, albeit a deadly one, had been deliberately and systematically dismantled by human will. It was a triumph of brute force public health, a testament to what could be achieved with enough organisation, enough more money, and a singular obsessive vision. It seemed the war was won, but victory, especially a victory against nature, is rarely permanent. It requires ceaseless vigilance, and vigilance is expensive. The first cracks in SOPA's grand edifice appeared not on the front lines, but in the halls of power. The United States, the primary funder of the Pan-American effort, had never fully committed to the war on its own soil. Eradication efforts in the southern states were patchy, underfunded, and ultimately abandoned. This left a vast, contiguous reservoir of Aedes aegypti, ready to re-invade the moment the defences to the south were lowered, and they were lowered. As the immediate threat of urban yellow fever faded from memory, so did the political will to keep paying for the vast army of guardas and the endless supply of chemicals. The programme was a victim of its own stunning success. How do you convince a politician to fund a war against an enemy no one can see anymore? Budgets were slashed. The meticulous house-to-house inspections grew infrequent, then stopped altogether. The institutional memory of how to run such a complex, continent-spanning operation began to fade. At the same time, the enemy was adapting. On the quiet, microscopic level of genetics, the mosquito was fighting back. The relentless application of DDT created an immense evolutionary pressure. The few mosquitoes that happened to possess a random genetic mutation, allowing them to survive a dose of the insecticide, were the only ones left to breed. They passed this resistance on to their offspring. Soon, entire populations of Aedes aegypti emerged that could happily rest on a wall coated in DDT and fly away unharmed. The miracle weapon was losing its magic. And then came the final blow, a cultural shift in how we saw our relationship with the planet. In 1962, Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, a lyrical, devastating indictment of the indiscriminate use of pesticides like DDT. The book awakened the modern environmental movement and recast the chemical from a life-saving miracle into a persistent, ecosystem-destroying poison. Though the human health benefits of its targeted indoor use were significant, public and political opinion turned decisively against it. The war on the mosquito lost its moral justification, and so in the early 1970s, the Great Campaign did not end with a bang, but with a whimper. It was quietly defunded, dismantled, and abandoned. The front lines dissolved, the veterans went home, and into the eerie, silent vacuum they left behind, the mosquito began its patient, inevitable return. The resurgence was not a dramatic, overnight invasion. It was a slow, creeping tide, a pandemic in slow motion, unfolding over decades. The Aedes aegypti mosquito, having been pushed to the geographic margins, now began its great recolonization of the American continent. It did not need to fly far. It simply hitched a ride with us. The 1970s and 80s were a time of unprecedented change in Latin America. New highways cut through landscapes that had been isolated for centuries. International trade exploded, and one of the most common items of this new global commerce was the used tyre. Shipped by the millions from temperate countries to be retreaded and resold in the tropics, these tyres were perfect mosquito incubators. They were impossible to stack in a way that didn't collect rainwater. Their dark rubber interiors protected larvae from the sun, and they were transported everywhere. A small clutch of mosquito eggs laid in a puddle inside a tyre in Louisiana could, weeks later, hatch in a scrapyard on the outskirts of Sao Paulo, founding a new dynasty in a city that had been mosquito-free for a generation. They travelled in the bilge water of ships, in shipments of lucky bamboo, in any cavity or container that could hold a few tablespoons of stagnant water. They followed our new roads, our new trade routes, our new prosperity, and where they arrived, they found a paradise waiting for them. This was also the era of the great urban migration. Millions of people were pouring from the countryside into cities, which were growing at a chaotic, unplanned pace. Sprawling slums, The favelas, the barrios, the pueblos jóvenes blossomed on the hillsides and floodplains around every major metropolis. These were communities built of ingenuity and desperation, often lacking basic services like piped water or reliable trash collection. For the residents, this meant water had to be stored in any available container: drums, buckets, tanks, cisterns. For Aedes aegypti, this landscape of countless perpetually replenished breeding sites was an open invitation to a feast. The very fabric of modern urbanizing Latin America had become the ideal habitat for its old enemy. The mosquito was not just back, it was more deeply, more intimately integrated into human life than ever before. All that was missing was the virus, and the jet engine provided the solution. While the mosquito was reconquering the continent by the land and sea, the 4 dengue serotypes were learning to travel by air. A tourist or a businessman could be bitten by a DENV3 infected mosquito in Manila, feel perfectly healthy while boarding a 747, and 12 hours later be walking through the airport in Caracas, a silent, mobile incubator. During the long decades of the mosquito eradication campaign, most of the population of the Americas had become immunologically naive. They had no antibodies, no memory of any of the 4 dengue serotypes. They were a blank slate. So now the stage was perfectly set. A continent-wide ocean of non-immune humans, a thriving and expanding population of vector mosquitoes living in their homes, and a new, high-speed delivery system capable of introducing any of the 4 viral serotypes at any time to any city with an airport. It was the most perfect storm imaginable. The world got its first glimpse of the terrifying potential of this new reality in 1981 in Cuba. In 1777, the island had experienced a large but relatively mild epidemic of dengue serotype 1. Tens of thousands were sick, but very few died. The population now carried the antibodies, the flawed keys, for DENV1. 4 years later, DENV2, a far more virulent serotype, arrived on the island, likely from Southeast Asia. What followed was a textbook, nation-scale demonstration of antibody-dependent enhancement. The pre-existing DENV1 antibodies, instead of offering protection, escorted the new virus into the cells of the Cuban people. The result was a public health catastrophe. In a few short months, over 340,000 people were infected. More than 10,000 of them developed the severe bleeding form of the disease, dengue hemorrhagic fever. 158 people, 101 of them children, died. For the first time, DHF, the deadly spectre from Southeast Asia, had exploded in the Americas. It was a brutal confirmation of Halstead's theory, and a grim warning of what was to come. By the 90s, the new reality was undeniable. Dengue was back. It was in Brazil, in Venezuela, in Colombia, in Mexico, pushing its way north and south. The old cyclical epidemics of breakbone fever were being replaced by a constant year-round transmission, punctuated by explosive outbreaks of the deadly hemorrhagic form. The war had been lost so completely that it had been forgotten. The forgotten tropical plague was now a permanent, aggressive and expanding feature of modern life, a slow-motion pandemic hiding in plain sight, patiently waiting in the water, collecting in the wreckage of our progress. To understand the true modern menace of dengue, we must look not at the mosquito, not at the patient, but deeper. We must shrink ourselves down, past the skin, past the bloodstream, to the realm of the infinitesimally small, to the molecular dance of predator and prey. Here, inside the very architecture of the virus itself, lies the secret to its cruelest trick. For dengue is not a single entity, it is a family, a dynasty of disease, a quartet of trouble. They are known to science, quite simply, as DNV1, DNV2, DNV3, and DNV4. 4 serotypes, 4 distinct yet intimately related viral signatures. Think of them not as identical twins, but as 4 dangerous siblings, all sharing the same family name and the same vicious habits, but each with its own unique personality, its own particular way of breaking into the house of the human body. When one of these siblings pays you a visit, your immune system, after a period of miserable, aching confusion, learns its face. It crafts a specific weapon, an antibody, a perfect lock and key defense designed to recognize and neutralize that one intruder for the rest of your life. If you are infected with DENV1, you will never be troubled by DENV1 again. Your body has its photograph, its fingerprint. The file is closed. A lifelong, unshakable immunity. This in itself is how most viruses work. A simple one-time transaction of sickness and recovery. But dengue's genius, its evolutionary masterstroke, is that the story does not end there. The photograph your body keeps of DNV1 is just clear enough to recognize its siblings, but not clear enough to stop them. In fact, it does something far, far worse. The antibody you produce to defeat the first serotype is a marvel of biological engineering. But when the second different serotype comes along, say DNV3, this old antibody makes a terrible mistake. It sees the family resemblance, it recognizes the shape, the general outline of the intruder, and it latches on. But the fit isn't perfect. The key doesn't quite turn in the lock, it cannot neutralize this new virus. Instead, it becomes an unwilling accomplice. The antibody, with the DENV3 virus now attached to its tail end, drifts through the bloodstream. When it encounters one of your immune cells, a macrophage, the macrophage recognizes the antibody, not the virus. It sees the antibody as a friendly flag, a signal to come and clean up a captured pathogen. The macrophage has a special receptor, a doorway just for these antibody tails. And so, with the misplaced confidence of a loyal soldier, the cell opens the door and invites the entire complex inside. The antibody has become a Trojan horse. The virus, which would have struggled to infect this hardened immune cell on its own, is now personally escorted past all security and delivered directly into the cell's productive heart. It has used your own defences, the very memory of your past victory, as a key to unlock the gates of your most powerful cells. This catastrophic error is known as antibody-dependent enhancement, or ADE. Once inside the macrophage, the virus hijacks the cell's machinery and begins to replicate with an explosive, terrifying speed. The viral load in the patient's blood skyrockets to levels 100, even 1,000 times higher than during a first infection. The body, sensing this overwhelming invasion, panics. The immune system unleashes a desperate full-scale chemical assault, a cytokine storm that rages not just against the virus, but against the body itself. It's this internal friendly fire, this storm of chemicals, that causes the true damage of severe dengue. It makes the blood vessels, the delicate pipes that carry life to every corner of your body, porous and leaky. Plasma, the vital fluid of the blood, begins to seep out into the surrounding tissues. Blood pressure plummets. Organs begin to fail from the lack of circulation. The blood itself, losing its fluid, thickens and refuses to clot, leading to the terrifying internal and external bleeding that gives dengue hemorrhagic fever its name. This deadly two-step dance is the engine of every major dengue epidemic. It explains why the Great Plagues of the post-war era were so different, so much more lethal than the break-bone fever of centuries past. Before the Second World War, dengue serotypes were largely isolated in their own geographical corners of the world. DNV1 might be circulating in Southeast Asia, while Denver-4 was confined to a few islands in the Pacific. A person was unlikely to encounter more than one type in their lifetime, but the war and the subsequent explosion in global travel and trade changed everything. It was like a grand, malevolent mixer of viruses. Soldiers, sailors, merchants, and eventually tourists began to carry these viral siblings across oceans and continents, introducing them into new, vulnerable populations. A city like Manila in the Philippines, which may have only contended with DNV1 for decades, suddenly found itself playing host to DNV2, brought in on a troopship or a cargo plane. A population with widespread immunity to the first serotype was now perfectly primed for a devastating epidemic of the second. And so it began. In Manila in 1953, in Bangkok in 1958, doctors began to see a new frightening version of the disease primarily in children who were experiencing their second dengue infection. They saw shock, hemorrhage, death on a scale never before associated with the old fever. They were witnessing, for the first time on a massive scale, the clinical reality of antibody-dependent enhancement. The 4 serotypes, once lonely monarchs in their own small kingdoms, were now co-circulating in the world's burgeoning tropical cities. The quartet was finally playing together, and their music was a symphony of suffering. The stage for the modern dengue crisis was set. All it needed was an even more efficient way to travel. The story of dengue's global march in the late 20th century is, in many ways, the story of an object, a humble, mundane, and profoundly ugly object, the used automobile tyre. For it was within the dark, water-collecting crescent of discarded rubber that a new villain found its ticket to see the world. For most of history, the primary villain of our story was Aedes aegypti, the yellow fever mosquito. It was a creature of the city, a domestic specialist. It had evolved alongside humanity, developing a taste for our blood and a talent for living in our homes, breeding in the water we stored in pots and cisterns. It was, and still is, the master vector of urban dengue. But it has a weakness. Aedes aegypti is a tropical creature, a delicate connoisseur of warmth and humidity. It does not fare well in the cold. Its eggs cannot survive a harsh winter. This simple fact of biology had, for millennia, created a climatic firewall, a line on the map beyond which dengue could not establish a permanent home. North America, Europe, the cooler parts of Asia, these were safe harbours. But globalization, in its relentless, thoughtless efficiency, was about to provide a way around that wall. Our new character emerges from the forests of Southeast Asia. Its scientific name is Aedes albopictus, but it is better known by its more vivid, more fitting name, the Asian tiger mosquito. It is a striking creature, smaller than many of its cousins, but etched with sharp, silvery white stripes on its black body and legs. It looks like it's dressed for a fight. And unlike the domestic Aegypta, albopictus is a rugged generalist. It is hardy, adaptable, aggressive. While Aegypti prefers to breed in clean stored water, albopictus is far less discerning. A forgotten bucket, a clogged gutter, a discarded food container, the cup of a flower, or a simple knot in a tree. Any small stagnant pool will do, is an opportunistic breeder and perfectly suited to the messy, cluttered landscape of the human suburb. And crucially, its eggs are tougher. They are resistant to drying out, and most importantly, they can enter a state of dormancy called diapause, allowing them to survive the cold of a temperate winter, waiting patiently for the spring thaw. Aedes albopictus was a mosquito with the potential for a global empire. It just needed a boat. The boat, it turned out, was the international trade in used tyres. In the 1970s and 80s, the economies of Asia were booming. Millions of new cars and trucks were hitting the roads, and they all needed tyres. As old tyres were replaced, mountains of them began to accumulate. For countries in North America and Europe, these used Asian tyres were a cheap commodity, valuable for retreading or for being shredded into a material called crumb rubber. And so a massive new shipping route was born. Millions upon millions of tyres, stacked high in the holds of cargo ships, began a slow journey across the Pacific Ocean. A tyre, by its very design, is a perfect vessel for collecting rainwater. And as these tyres sat in scrapyards in Japan, in Taiwan, in Malaysia, waiting for shipment, they filled with water. And the local tiger mosquitoes, opportunistic as ever, found these dark, protected pools to be ideal nurseries. They laid their eggs on the inner walls of the tyres, just above the waterline. The ships were loaded, the journey began, and the water eventually evaporated. But the eggs did not die. They clung to the rubber, dormant, waiting. The invasion of North America began officially in August of 1985. At the port of Houston, Texas, a routine inspection of a container ship filled with used tyres from Japan revealed something new. The inspectors found not just mosquito larvae wriggling in the watery residue, but a species they did not recognise. The specimens were sent to entomologists, who confirmed the alarming truth. Aedes albopictus had arrived. It was not the first time it had tried, of course. For decades it had likely been a stowaway on countless ships, a casual tourist. But this time was different. The scale of the tire trade was now immense. It wasn't one or two mosquitoes arriving, it was a constant steady wave of colonists. From Houston, the invasion spread with astonishing speed. The used tire trade didn't just stop at the ports. The tires were loaded onto trucks and trains and shipped to every corner of the country, to recycling plants and landfills. Each tire was a potential colonization pod, carrying a clutch of hardy eggs. Within a decade, the Asian tiger mosquito had established itself in over 20 states, from the swamps of Florida to the suburbs of New Jersey. It had crossed the climatic firewall. Europe's turn came in 1990. A shipment of used tires, this time from the state of Georgia in the United States, arrived in the port of Genoa, Italy. The descendants of the original Asian invaders had now become invaders themselves, completing a full circuit of the globe. From Italy, albopictus began its march across Europe. It spread through France, along the Mediterranean coast, up into the Balkans, and even established pockets in Germany and the Netherlands. It became a common backyard pest, an aggressive and unwelcome daytime biter, a nuisance that people in temperate climates had never had to contend with before. For years, this was seen primarily as an entomological curiosity, a problem of pest control. The public health implications were largely theoretical. Yes, albopictus was known to be a potential vector for dengue, but the virus itself was not present in these newly colonized regions. The mosquito had arrived, but its deadly luggage had not. That comfortable assumption was shattered in the summer of 2007. In the small, quiet towns of Ravenna, Italy, people began to fall ill with a strange fever, a painful rash, and debilitating joint pain. It wasn't dengue. It was a related virus, chikungunya, which the tiger mosquito is also exceptionally good at transmitting. The outbreak was traced to a single traveller returning from India, who was then bitten by the local, now well-established albopictus population. The mosquito picked up the virus and began to spread it to his neighbours. It was a shocking wake-up call. The tiger in the suburbs was no longer a theoretical threat. It was a competent, established vector, waiting for a spark. Outbreaks of locally transmitted dengue soon followed. France saw its first cases in 2010. Croatia in the same year. The island of Madeira suffered a massive epidemic in 2012. These were not enormous plagues on the scale of Southeast Asia, but they were something far more unsettling. They were proof of concept. The intricate, globalized machine of human commerce had accidentally, carelessly seeded the temperate world with a tiny striped predator. And now the disease it was built to carry was beginning to follow, arriving one infected airplane passenger at a time. The old safe harbours were safe no more. The relentless geographical advance of the mosquito and its virus created a new urgency in a quest that had been quietly proceeding in laboratories for over half a century, the race for a vaccine. From the outside, the problem seems straightforward. We have vaccines for measles, for polio, for yellow fever. Why not for dengue? The answer once again lies with the four troublesome siblings, the quartet. Any successful dengue vaccine faces a unique and terrifying hurdle that vaccine developers for other diseases never have to consider. It must not fail. More specifically, it must not fail partials. A vaccine that produced a powerful, robust immunity to all four serotypes at once would be a world-changing triumph. But a vaccine that only worked well against, say, 3 of the serotypes, or that produced only a weak, temporary immunity, could be an absolute catastrophe. It could, in effect, act like a first natural infection. It could prime a person's immune system for the deadly trap of antibody-dependent enhancement. By trying to protect someone, you could inadvertently set them up for a catastrophic case of severe dengue if they later encountered the virus in the wild. This was the scientist's tightrope. The balancing act was exquisitely difficult. The early efforts, many of them pioneered by the United States military at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, focused on live attenuated vaccines. The concept is to take the real virus and weaken it, to domesticate it, passing it over and over through cell cultures until it loses its ferocity but retains its shape, just enough to teach the immune system what to look for without causing disease. But with dengue, you had to do this 4 times, creating 4 separate weakened viruses. Then you had to combine them into a single shot, a tetravalent cocktail. And when you mix them, the 4 weakened viruses began to compete with each other. One serotype might replicate too strongly, dominating the others and producing a lopsided immunity. Another might be too weak, failing to provoke a response at all. For decades, researchers struggled with this problem of viral interference, tweaking their formulas, searching for the perfect, harmonious balance. It was less like chemistry and more like trying to train 4 wild animals to perform a synchronized dance. By the early 2000s, a new and elegant approach emerged from the French pharmaceutical giant Sanofi Pasteur. Their idea was to build the dengue vaccine on a proven, reliable foundation, the yellow fever vaccine. The yellow fever vaccine is one of the safest and most effective ever created, a live attenuated virus that has been in use for decades. The Sanofi scientists embarked on a remarkable feat of genetic engineering. They took the yellow fever vaccine virus and, using molecular scissors, they cut out the genes that give the virus its outer coat. In their place, they spliced in the corresponding coat genes from DENV1. They then repeated the process for DENV2, DENV3 and DENV4, creating 4 separate chimeric viruses. Each one had the harmless engine of the yellow fever vaccine on the inside, but wore the disguise of a dengue serotype on the outside. This, they hoped, would solve the interference problem and present all 4 dengue signatures to the immune system in a balanced way. The result was a vaccine candidate called CYD-TDV, which would come to be known by its brand name, Dengvaxia. The development of Dengvaxia was a monumental undertaking. It was tested in a series of massive clinical trials, enrolling over 30,000 children across 10 countries in Asia and Latin America, the largest dengue vaccine trials ever conducted. The initial results, published around 2014, were met with cautious optimism. The vaccine wasn't perfect, but it seemed to work. It showed an overall efficacy of about 60% against symptomatic dengue. Crucially, it appeared to be about 90% effective at preventing the most severe, life-threatening forms of the disease. For a world desperate for a tool against the rising tide of dengue, this seemed like a breakthrough. The Philippines, a country that suffers immensely from the disease, was one of the first to embrace it. In the spring of 2016, the Philippine Department of Health launched an unprecedented school-based mass vaccination program aiming to immunize over 1 million children in the country's dengue hotspots. It was a moment of immense national pride and public health hope. The first ever dengue vaccine was being rolled out, and Filipino children would be the first to benefit. Vials of Dengvaxia were distributed, needles were prepared, and the program began. For 18 months, the program continued, and then, in November of 2017, the world of dengue research was shaken to its core. Sanofi Pasteur issued a stunning announcement. They had completed a longer-term analysis of their trial data, and it had revealed a hidden, deeply disturbing pattern. The vaccine, it turned out, behaved very differently depending on a person's prior exposure to dengue. For children who had already had a dengue infection before they were vaccinated, who were seropositive, the vaccine worked as intended, acting as a booster and providing strong protection. But for children who had never been exposed to dengue, the seronegative group, the vaccine was a ticking time bomb. For them, the vaccine acted just like a first silent dengue infection. It built up the antibodies, the flawed memory, but it didn't provide complete protection. If these children were later infected with the real dengue virus, their vaccine-primed immune systems were susceptible to the same catastrophic process of antibody-dependent enhancement that follows a second natural infection. The vaccine given to the wrong person could increase their risk of developing severe hemorrhagic dengue fever. The fallout in the Philippines was immediate and devastating. The government halted the vaccination program overnight, but by then, over 800,000 children had already received at least one dose. An unknown number of them were seronegative and had potentially been placed in harm's way. A wave of public panic and political outrage swept the nation. The media was filled with heartbreaking stories of children who had been vaccinated and later fell ill. Though proving a direct causal link in any individual case was nearly impossible, the narrative was set. The vaccine was a poison. The government and the drug company had experimented on their children. Trust in the public health system, and in vaccines in general, evaporated. The Dengue scandal became a textbook case in the complexities of immunology and the perils of public health policy. It wasn't a story of malice, but of hubris. A story of a scientific community so focused on solving a difficult problem that it missed the most dangerous subtlety. The race to create a weapon against the four serotypes had succeeded, but in doing so it had created a new, unforeseen trap for those it was meant to protect. The long search for a shield against dengue had stumbled, and in its wake it left a legacy of fear and mistrust that would haunt the next generation of vaccines for years to come. The great campaigns of the mid-20th century were, in their own way, acts of total war. They were waged with chemical weapons, with vast logistical chains, with surveillance and brute force. They sought to eradicate an enemy, to wipe Aedes aegypti from the face of the Americas. And for a time they seemed to work. But the mosquito returned, more resistant, more widespread than ever. The chemicals failed, the budgets dried up, the political will evaporated. The fever came back with a vengeance. For decades the fight was a stalemate, a low-grade attritional conflict fought with fogging trucks and public health posters, a war of containment, not victory. But quietly, in laboratories far from the front lines, a new strategy was being conceived. It was not a plan to kill the mosquito, but to change it, to disarm it from within, using an invisible ally, a secret agent that had been hiding in plain sight for millions of years. This new weapon was not a chemical, but a bacterium. Its name was Wolbachia pipientis. It is by any measure one of the most successful organisms on Earth. A tiny intracellular microbe, Wolbachia, lives inside the cells of its host. It is a master manipulator, a quiet puppet master of insect reproduction. It infects perhaps 60% of all insect species on the planet: ants, fruit flies, moths, dragonflies. But for some ancient evolutionary reason, it was not found in the one that mattered most to us, Aedes aegypti. The discovery of its potential was a slow burn, a puzzle assembled over decades. Scientists knew that Wolbachia could skew the sex ratios of its hosts or kill off the males, or create a strange biological state called cytoplasmic incompatibility, where infected males can only reproduce successfully with infected females. This trick, this reproductive advantage, allows it to sweep through an insect population with astonishing speed. It was a fascinating quirk of biology. For a long time, nothing more. The critical leap came from a persistent Australian scientist named Scott O'Neill. His thought process was audacious, almost bordering on science fiction. What if you could take this bacterium and introduce it into the one mosquito that had always eluded it? What if you could force an infection? The technical challenge was immense. Wolbachia cannot survive outside a host cell. You couldn't simply spray it into the air. It had to be passed down from mother to offspring. The only way in was through the egg. This required an almost impossibly delicate feat of microengineering. Under a microscope, researchers used a needle finer than a human hair to draw cytoplasm containing Wolbachia from an infected fruit fly egg and inject it with surgical precision into a microscopic Aedes aegypti egg. It was painstaking, tedious work. Thousands upon thousands of eggs were injected. Most died. Most of the survivors failed to incorporate the bacteria, but eventually, after years of trial and error in the early 2000s, they succeeded. They created a stable line of Aedes aegypti mosquitoes that carried Wolbachia, and crucially passed it down to their children. This was the first hurdle cleared. But a startling and far more important discovery was yet to come. The original plan had been to use the bacterium's reproductive skewing abilities to simply crash the mosquito population. But in the lab, O'Neill's team noticed something else, something entirely unexpected. When these newly infected mosquitoes were fed on blood laced with the dengue virus, the virus struggled to replicate inside them. It was as if the mosquito's body, already hosting a massive population of bacteria, simply didn't have the room or the resources for the virus to take hold. The Wolbachia acted as a kind of microbial vaccine for the mosquito. It outcompeted the virus for key molecules like cholesterol. It primed the mosquito's own immune system, making it more hostile to the viral invader. The effect was profound. The bacteria didn't kill the mosquito. It simply made it a terrible home for dengue. A mosquito that cannot incubate the virus cannot transmit the virus. The vector was effectively neutralized. This transformed the project from a population suppression strategy to a population replacement strategy. The goal was no longer to eradicate the mosquito, but to replace the existing dangerous population with a new, harmless one, a self-sustaining biological control method. The idea, which would eventually grow into the non-profit World Mosquito Program, was ready for its first test in the real world. The location chosen was Cairns, a city in the tropical north of Australia, a place all too familiar with small but persistent dengue outbreaks. The process began not with science, but with sociology. You cannot simply release thousands of genetically modified organisms, even if the modification is just an infection with a common bacterium, into a community without its permission. Teams went door to door. They held town hall meetings. They explained the science in schools, in community centres, using simple graphics and clear language. They had to overcome the natural primal fear of the mosquito to convince people that releasing more mosquitoes was the solution. It took years of patient, careful engagement to build the necessary trust. Then in 2011, the releases began. It was not a high-tech affair. Volunteers, including local school children, were given small cardboard tubs containing a few hundred Wolbachia-infected mosquito eggs. They would add water, and over the next week or so the eggs would hatch, the larvae would mature, and a new generation of benign mosquitoes would emerge in their backyards. Week after week they released them. Scientists monitored the local mosquito population, trapping them and testing them for the telltale presence of the bacteria. At first the numbers were small, but Wolbachia has its own relentless evolutionary logic. The infected females passed it to all their offspring, and because of cytoplasmic incompatibility, the wild, uninfected females who mated with released infected males produced eggs that simply wouldn't hatch. The bacterium was driving itself through the population. Within a matter of months, close to 100% of the Aedes aegypti in the trial zones carried Wolbachia. And then the city watched and waited. The dengue cases, which had always bubbled up in the hot, wet season, simply stopped. An outbreak would be seeded by a traveller. A single case would appear, but it wouldn't go anywhere. The chain of transmission was broken. The success in Australia was a proof of concept, but the true test would be in the megacities of Asia and Latin America, the global epicentres of the dengue pandemic. The scale was daunting. One of the most significant trials took place in Yogyakarta, a densely populated city of 400,000 people on the Indonesian island of Java. Beginning in 2017, the city was divided into 24 districts. Half were randomly selected to receive the Wolbachia mosquitoes. The other half would act as a control. The logistics were immense. A local factory was converted into a mosquito breeding facility capable of producing millions of eggs a week. The release method was refined. Buckets containing eggs were hung from lampposts and trees in a grid patterns across the city's complex network of streets and alleyways. For nearly 2 years, the team seeded the city with its microscopic allies. The results, published in 2021, were stunning, a landmark in the history of public health. In the parts of the city where the Wolbachia mosquitoes had been released, there was a 7% reduction in dengue cases, Hospitalizations from dengue fell by 86%. It was a triumph not of chemicals or brute force, but of elegant, sophisticated biology. The same story began to repeat itself elsewhere. In Medellin, Colombia, once a city ravaged by the disease, cases plummeted by over 95% after releases began. From Rio de Janeiro in Brazil to Nha Trang in Vietnam, the bacterial weapon was being deployed. It is not a perfect solution. It is extensive and logistically complex to implement. It doesn't work against other mosquito-borne diseases like malaria, which are carried by different species, and there is always the faint background worry that the virus could, one day, evolve a way to overcome the bacterium's blocking effect. But it represents the first genuinely new and profoundly effective tool in the fight against dengue in over half a century. A quiet microbial revolution spreading one backyard at a time, a testament to the idea that sometimes the most effective way to fight nature is with nature itself. And yet, even as this elegant biological solution began its slow, methodical march across the globe, a far larger force was at work, a force that threatened to undo all progress, to push the boundaries of the fever map far beyond its historical borders. This force was not a virus or a bacterium, but a change in the very chemistry of the sky, a planetary-scale fever that was creating a perfect, borderless world for the mosquito. The careful, localized victories of Wolbachia were being waged against the rising tide of global climate change, an accelerant that was pouring fuel on a fire that had been burning for centuries. The connection is brutally, elegantly simple. Aedes aegypti is a creature of the heat. Like all insects, it is cold-blooded, its internal metronome set by the ambient temperature of the world around it. For dengue, this relationship is governed by a few critical thermal thresholds. Below about 15 degrees Celsius, the mosquito is sluggish, its development stalls, and it struggles to survive. But as the temperature rises, its entire life cycle accelerates. Warmer water means the aquatic larvae and pupae mature faster, shortening the time from egg to adult, increasing the overall size of the mosquito population. The adult female mosquito becomes more active in warmer weather, her metabolism speeds up, she digests her blood meals faster, and therefore she needs to bite more frequently to lay her eggs. More bites mean more opportunities to acquire and transmit the virus. But the most crucial effect of heat happens inside the mosquito. After an Aedes mosquito bites an infected person, the dengue virus does not simply sit passively in its gut. It must undergo a period of replication and dissemination, first infecting the mosquito's midgut cells, then spreading through its body until it reaches the salivary glands. Only then can the mosquito transmit the disease with its next bite. This is the extrinsic incubation period, or EIP. At a balmy 25 degrees Celsius, this process might take 10 to 12 days. An eternity in the short 2 to 4 week life of a mosquito. Many will die before they ever become infectious. But raise the temperature to 30 degrees, a common daily high in the tropics and increasingly common in subtropical and temperate summers, and that incubation period can be slashed in half, to as little as 5 or 6 days. The mosquito becomes a far more efficient vector, a faster burning fuse for an epidemic. For centuries, these thermal limits acted as a natural geographic barrier. Dengue was a disease of the tropics, a breakbone fever, confined to the hot, humid belt around the planet's equator. Temperate regions were safe. Their winters were too cold for the mosquito to establish permanent populations, and their summers were too short and mild for efficient viral transmission. Climate change is systematically dismantling that barrier. We are witnessing, in real time, a great expansion, a viral colonization of the globe. The isotherm lines, those invisible contours of average temperature, are creeping steadily away from the equator, moving poleward year by year, and the mosquitoes are following them. The evidence is no longer theoretical. It is written in the public health records of countries that once considered themselves immune. In southern Europe, a new front in the old war has opened. Aedes albopictus, the hardier, more cold-tolerant Asian tiger mosquito, had already established itself across the continent, a stowaway in the international trade of used tyres and lucky bamboo. For years it was a nuisance biter, nothing more, but as summers grew longer and hotter, the continent became permissive for transmission. In 2007, a small town in northern Italy, Ravenna, experienced the first local dengue transmission event in modern European history. An infected traveller returned from India, was bitten by local tiger mosquitoes, and a small contained outbreak followed. It was a warning shot. By the 2020s, it was no longer a fluke. France began reporting dozens, then hundreds of locally acquired cases each summer, particularly in the sun-drenched region of Provence. Italy, Spain, Croatia all began to see the fever take root. These were not imported cases from returning tourists. They were cases transmitted by local mosquitoes to local residents. The disease had crossed the Mediterranean. It is also a fever that is climbing mountains. Historically, high-altitude regions were safe havens. The cool mountain air was a fortress against the mosquito. In Latin America, cities like Bogotá, Colombia, at 2,600 meters, were considered dengue-free. But as global temperatures rise, these high-altitude environments are warming faster than the global average. The freezing line is moving up the mountainsides, and so is Aedes aegypti. Dengue transmission is now regularly reported in highland areas of Colombia and Peru that were once too cold to sustain it. In Nepal, the disease, once confined to the low-lying southern plains, is now found in the capital, Kathmandu, in the foothills of the Himalayas. The mosquito has learned to climb. The changing climate is also altering the water. Shifting rainfall patterns create a chaotic rhythm of drought and deluge that is perfectly suited to the mosquito's life cycle. More intense, erratic downpours create a proliferation of temporary puddles and fill countless containers with stagnant water, creating an explosion of breeding sites. Conversely, prolonged periods of drought can be just as dangerous. As municipal water supplies become unreliable, people are forced to store water in their homes, in drums, tanks, buckets, and cisterns. These open containers, often uncovered, become ideal, permanent nurseries for Aedes larvae, bringing the vector into the most intimate domestic spaces. The El Niño Southern Oscillation, a natural climate cycle, has always been a major driver of large-scale dengue epidemics. El Niño years, with their warmer, wetter conditions in Southeast Asia and Latin America, are dengue years. But climate change is amplifying these events, making them more frequent and more intense. The record-breaking global heat of 2023 and 2024, supercharged by a strong El Niño, triggered the worst dengue epidemic the Americas had ever seen. Brazil, Peru, Argentina, countries were overwhelmed. Health systems buckled under the sheer volume of cases numbering in the millions. It was a terrifying preview of a hotter future, a world where the emergency state becomes the new normal. The mosquito is not just adapting, it is thriving in the instability we have created. It is a creature of the Anthropocene, perfectly suited to a world of warmer temperatures, extreme weather, and disordered human settlements. And so we arrive at our present moment, contemplating a plague that seems perfectly designed for the world we are building. A world that is more crowded, more connected, and profoundly warmer than at any point in human history. Dengue is the quintessential disease of the 21st century city. It is a fever born of globalization, urbanization, and environmental decay. And despite its staggering scale, infecting up to 400 million people each year, killing tens of thousands, and putting nearly half of humanity at risk, it remains a curiously neglected disease. A forgotten plague hiding in plain sight. It has never commanded the global fear or the research funding of diseases like HIV, tuberculosis, or malaria. There are no celebrity telethons for dengue. Part of this neglect is a matter of geography and economics. It is overwhelmingly a disease of the poor, a tax on the developing world. Its epicenters are the sprawling informal settlements of Southeast Asia, the favelas of Brazil, the crowded neighborhoods of the Indian subcontinent. It thrives in places with inconsistent waste collection, where a discarded tire or a plastic food container can become a mosquito nursery. It flourishes where homes lack window screens and reliable piped water, forcing residents to store it in open containers. Because its mortality rate is relatively low compared to other pathogens, around 1% of severe cases with proper medical care, it is often perceived as a background threat, a miserable but accepted part of life in the tropics, like the seasonal flu in temperate climates. It causes immense suffering, lost school days, and crippling economic damage, but it rarely makes headlines in the global north. It is a quiet, attritional plague, not a dramatic, explosive one. This neglect is also rooted in the immense scientific difficulty of fighting it. The virus itself is a formidable opponent. Its 4 distinct serotypes create a unique and treacherous immunological landscape. Infection with one type provides lifelong immunity to that specific serotype, but only temporary cross-protection against the others. A second infection with a different serotype is often far more severe, thanks to the paradoxical phenomenon of antibody-dependent enhancement, where antibodies from the first infection can actually help the new virus invade cells, leading to a greater risk of dengue hemorrhagic fever. This 4-fold nature has been the great stumbling block for vaccine development. A successful vaccine must be tetravalent, providing strong and balanced protection against all 4 serotypes simultaneously. An unbalanced vaccine could be worse than no vaccine at all, potentially priming a person for a more severe infection if they are later exposed to one of the serotypes it doesn't cover well. This immunological tightrope walk has bedeviled researchers for decades, resulting in a handful of licensed vaccines that come with significant safety and efficacy concerns, particularly for those who have never been infected before. And so, the story of dengue is a synthesis of all the threads we have followed. It is a story of evolution, a jungle virus that 2 centuries ago made a fateful leap into the human world, finding a perfect partner in a mosquito that had also adapted to live among us. It is a story of human movement, carried across oceans on sailing ships, spread between continents on jet aircraft, its geographic expansion mirroring our own relentless interconnectivity. It is a story of unintended consequences, the failure of the great chemical campaigns of the 20th century, which left behind insecticide-resistant mosquitoes and a world without herd immunity, setting the stage for the explosive resurgence of the 1970s and beyond. And now, it is a story of environmental change, as the warming of the planet systematically erases the climatic barriers that once contained the disease, pushing the mosquito and its viral cargo into new territories, from the mountains of Nepal to the suburbs of Paris. What then does the future hold? It will almost certainly be a future with more dengue, a future where seasonal outbreaks in Europe, North America and other temperate regions are no longer a surprise, but an expectation. A future where the tools we have, the elegant biology of Wolbachia, the imperfect protection of vaccines, the laborious work of vector control are in a constant race against the accelerating pressures of a changing climate and a growing urbanizing population. The fight will be waged not just in laboratories, but with sanitation departments. It will depend as much on proper waste management and the design of urban water systems as it will on molecular biology. The story of this fever is, in the end, a mirror. It reflects the deep inequalities of our world, the forgotten costs of our globalized economy, and the planetary consequences of our addiction to fossil fuels. The mosquito is not the true villain of this story. It is merely the messenger, a tiny, exquisitely adapted courier delivering a message that we have been sending to ourselves. A message about the intricate, fragile connections between our health, our cities, and our climate. It is a fever that rose from the disruptions of the past, that is defined by the challenges of the present, and that will be a constant humming presence in the background of our ever-warmer future. A fever that has been with us for centuries and one that has not yet broken.